Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another live stream history podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Jodi Magness. And today we're going to be discussing Nazareth. Did it actually exist? There are some people out there that think that Nazareth didn't exist. Simply because, like, oh, look through Josephus, and he never mentions it. So why would he not mention Nazareth? So what kind of evidence do we have that indicate that Nazareth existed?
Right. So, it's a really interesting question. Let me just say, first of all, that I do believe that Nazareth existed in the time of Jesus. So just to put myself on that side of it. But,
Right.
Our information about the past is extremely incomplete. I mean, in most cases, we have just a small percentage of remains or literary evidence about different periods in the past that survived. And so if we went according to the principle of, well, we only what we have remains of or literary references to in any given period, existed, we would be in a lot of trouble because we just don't have that much evidence. I'll just give an example. So a couple of examples. So Caesarea Maritima, Herod's great port city on the Mediterranean, was originally founded as a Phoenician town called Straton's Tower. But the remains of Straton's Tower have eluded archaeologists, much as archaeologists have looked for that. Apparently because when Herod built Caesarea, his monumental remains obliterated the earlier remains. And I don't know of anybody who really disputes that there was a Straton's Tower somewhere on the site of Caesarea, but okay, we don't have, remains with, and the same thing, for example, with Masada. Josephus actually does mention that one of the Hasmonean kings originally fortified Masada. And in fact, when Herod fled in 40 BC at the time of the Parthian invasion, he deposited his family for safekeeping on top of Masada because there was a fortress up there. But the excavations on top of Masada, which have been very extensive and pretty thorough, have failed to bring to light any remains that conclusively can be, I should say, architectural remains that can conclusively be identified with, an earlier Hasmonean king. And so this is not an unusual situation in archaeology. So why wouldn't Josephus mention Nazareth? Well, then you'd have to assume that Josephus would have mentioned every single site that existed in the country in his time, and we know that's not the case as well. I think it's likely that Nazareth wasn't mentioned by Josephus because it wasn't important enough, or it didn't figure in the kind of history he's telling. In fact, the archaeological remains that we have associated with Nazareth are pretty scanty. They're there, but they're pretty scanty. And they seem to indicate that Nazareth was a really small village, and some archaeologists have described it as a hamlet in the time of Jesus. And that would really go a long way to explaining why Josephus wouldn't have mentioned it. I mean, there were like little hamlets all over the place, apparently, and Nazareth was one of them. And Josephus probably didn't mention most of them because they weren't important enough. So, I mean, it comes down to, I know that, the big debate is about, Nazareth and its connection to Jesus in the gospel accounts. But there again, I see no reason to sort of doubt that there was a Nazareth at the time of Jesus. The question is, what did it look like? How big was it? And what archaeological remains do we have that we can identify associated with it? So here again, we get into the problem of scantiness, and it's not just scantiness, it's also the nature of archaeology and the way things are built up over time. So in the case of Nazareth, what we seem to have is, again, a very small village or even a hamlet of modest houses that you would find in a rural Galilean setting of the first century. So we're not talking monumental architecture. And there are several levels of problems here. So one problem is that the excavations that have been conducted in that area include some very important excavations by an Israeli archaeologist named Yardena Alexander about 15 years ago. And unfortunately, although she published some preliminary reports, she has not yet, as far as I know at least, published a full and final scientific excavation report. So it's impossible to examine exactly what it is that she has. Now, that said, Yardena, who I know and who's a really good archaeologist, specifically refers to houses. She found the remains of one or more houses that can be dated from the first century BC through the second century AD, based on the pottery and associated finds. And again, she's a good archaeologist. She knows her stuff. It is possible to distinguish between pottery that dates, let's say, to the first century BC, first century AD, and the second century. There are distinctions in the pottery types of this period. So when she gives that range, I personally have no reason to doubt. I would like to see the final report at some point. This is not actually inconsistent with excavations that were conducted a number of years ago, much longer ago, by a Franciscan archaeologist, Bagatti, who also found a small amount of pottery and other finds that also are from kind of this time range. Now, that's one of the problems. The major problem in trying to identify archaeological remains in Nazareth is because of the nature of the site. And this is actually very common in archaeology when you have sites like this, where you have basically continuous occupation over the course of centuries, and even sometimes not continuous, but anyway, later occupation. And so what happens is, and especially when these early remains are not monumental buildings, the later builders often then cleared away any earlier remains down to bedrock so that they could found their buildings on bedrock. And so these earliest remains, which actually are built in, on top of bedrock, and sometimes there are even installations in these buildings like pits or cisterns for storing water, mikvaots, ritual baths, stuff like that are cut into the bedrock itself. So in the course of later overbuilding, they would clear away the earlier, walls and whatever in order to found their buildings on bedrock and pretty much obliterate the earlier remains. And this is, again, we see this in other places. I just mentioned Caesarea Masada as examples. And so in the case of Nazareth, which becomes, of course, such an important pilgrimage site beginning in the 4th century, and then you begin to get lots of pilgrims pouring in and eventually churches built, on top. A lot of those later remains, that later building simply obliterated the earlier remains. And that would explain, at least in part, why the archaeological remains are so scanty. And then the final difficulty here, and this is also not uncommon in a site like Nazareth. We see it in other sites like Jerusalem, for example, where you have a site or a city that is now a living city, people living in it. Nazareth is a huge city now, very densely inhabited. And so it's impossible for the most part for archaeologists to reach those earlier levels because they're buried deep underneath modern buildings and streets and houses and shops, and there's just no way to get to them. So the little bits that we have from Nazareth are very scattered because of the nature of Nazareth today. So all of this is to say that we do have, in my opinion, pretty good evidence, both literary, if we consider the gospel accounts, and archaeological, for the existence of Nazareth in the 1st century, in the time of Jesus. And that picture is really consistent with what we see at other archaeological sites, and also what we would expect from the nature of Nazareth today.
What else do we know about Nazareth? For instance, was it densely populated in Jesus' time, or did it have a small population?
Well, we can't answer that question unless we get the opportunity to conduct larger scale excavations, which I don't expect will happen anytime soon. But the evidence that we have at this point, which again is very from very small areas of excavation and kind of scattered, would suggest that it was a very small village or hamlet with just a very small number of inhabitants. And again, this would explain why one of the reasons why Josephus might not have mentioned it. Now, so if we take a look at references to Nazareth outside of the gospel accounts, we want to look at literary references, right? We do start to get those, of course, in the 4th century. Not surprising, when Christianity became a legal religion in the Roman Empire and then the official religion of the Roman Empire. So we begin to get Christian interest in Nazareth and literary references. And so we already have in the early 4th century a reference by Eusebius to one of the church fathers to Nazareth. And then as we go through the 4th century, we get additional references to Nazareth. In the late 4th, early 5th century, Jerome refers to it as a small village, Aviculus, which is consistent. A pilgrim of the late 4th century, Egeria, visited there and describes an altar located. So, all of this indicates that by the 4th century, Christian pilgrims had begun to visit Nazareth, and then over the course of time, eventually, chapels and churches began to be built on that site. So that's what we have in terms of literary evidence. Now, I know that part of this argument over Nazareth and whether it existed in the time of Jesus as well, but we don't really get references to Nazareth until the 4th century. And so, besides the gospel accounts, what do we have that goes back to the time of Jesus? And I actually think that there is a smoking gun here that has not been recognized by other scholars. And that is something called the priestly courses. And this is something Jewish. So for people who are not familiar with this, so the priests who served in the ancient Jerusalem temple were divided into groups called courses. And they served for a couple of weeks. That is their course, right? They would serve their course for a couple of weeks in the temple in Jerusalem, and then they would go back after they were done to their families and homes, which were not necessarily in Jerusalem. They lived all around the country. And so this division of the priests into these courses is described in the book of 1 Chronicles in the Hebrew Bible. And then what happens is in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, we begin to get references to the priestly courses in some Jewish sources. And there are, by the way, references to priestly courses in other Jewish sources as well. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, we begin to get references to them in rabbinic literature, right? The Talmud. And we also get, in somewhere between the 4th to 6th centuries, a series of inscriptions that apparently were posted in synagogues, placed in synagogues of that period. So we're talking late antiquity again, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, inscriptions that list the priestly courses, because, these different courses or priestly families were from different places. And so the inscriptions will say, the priestly course from such and such a place. And both in rabbinic literature, in the Talmud, and in a couple of inscriptions, Nazareth is mentioned as the home of a priestly course. So this is kind of interesting. So by, let's say, the 3rd, 4th centuries, right, Nazareth is mentioned in Jewish sources as the location of a priestly course. Now, that's interesting because it's completely independent of the Christian evidence, right? The rabbis, right, who produced rabbinic literature, who produced the Talmud, had no interest, I don't think, in verifying the existence of Nazareth because of Jesus, right? And there's no reference to Jesus, of course, in any of this. But what's even more interesting is that an Israeli archaeologist named Uzi Liebner wrote a book and did a study. He's done an extensive survey of Galilee. And in his study, he looked at the sites that are mentioned in the priestly courses from this period. So let's say 3rd to 4th centuries and then 6th century and these inscriptions and so on. He looked at the sites that are mentioned in relation to the priestly courses. Now, not not every site can be identified today with a known site. But in the cases of sites that we know today can be identified with certainty, that are mentioned in connection with the priestly courses, Uzi Liebner noticed a very interesting thing. And that is that every single one of them, and here he wasn't talking about Nazareth, by the way, but every single one of them has archaeological evidence showing that it already was occupied, that site was already inhabited in the Hasmonean period, meaning the period before the time of Jesus. The Hasmoneans were the successors of the Maccabees. So we're talking 2nd and 1st centuries BC. And so he basically writes that in every single case, every one of these sites can be traced as going back to the Hasmonean period. And he believes that the priestly courses, this list that we see from later in late antiquity, that they actually preserve a memory and are based on memories of sites that were already inhabited in the Hasmonean period. And if that's the case, and again, every other site that he mentions fits this profile, then that would be yet another piece of evidence that Nazareth was already a Jewish village in the Hasmonean period. It doesn't mean, by the way, there's a whole nother debate about whether priestly families, these priestly courses actually lived in these specific villages or towns and how they come to be associated with them. That's a whole nother question. But for our purposes, what we're interested in, it does suggest that there is evidence that there was a Jewish memory of settlement at Nazareth and at these other sites, that these sites had already been established and inhabited by the Hasmonean period. So that's a really interesting piece of evidence that I think has been largely overlooked in the debates about Nazareth.
So is the Hasmonean period, is that as far back in terms of like, based on what the archaeological evidence that we currently have suggests, Nazareth goes as far back as the Hasmonean period, or is there evidence that we have of it going back even earlier than that?
Okay, so that's an interesting question and kind of hard to answer based on the limited evidence that we have. That for the Hasmonean period would span basically the mid-2nd to mid-1st century BC. And again, what Yardena Alexander describes, for example, from her excavations, and then the pottery that we see in Bagati's excavations, it goes, and as they said, it goes from 1st century BC to and then on up from there. So in fact, what if we take Uzi Liebner's observation and apply it to Nazareth, it is not inconsistent with the archaeological evidence, right? It may be that there's some material that goes back even to the 2nd century BC, but so far what's been published, we can say at least goes back to the 1st century BC. Now, whether what we have from earlier is a whole other question. I mean, if you look, for example, at Bagati's excavation report, which was published, again, a long time ago, he's got tombs there that date to like the Bronze Age, right? But that doesn't mean that the site was called Nazareth already in the Bronze Age. I don't think we know what it would have been called in the Bronze Age. And it also doesn't mean that occupation at the site was continuous from the Bronze Age. Bronze Age, we're referring to the 3rd millennium and, kind of into the 2nd millennium BC. I don't know that, we have any evidence that there was continuous occupation at Nazareth or what its name would have been in earlier periods.
So I want to go back to the literary evidence real quick. So the Gospels, are they currently the earliest text to even mention Nazareth at all so far?
Yeah, I guess that's right.
And so one can probably reasonably assume that if Jesus perhaps came from Nazareth, that would obviously be why to the early Christians, Nazareth was important to them, but not necessarily to everyone else, because Nazareth was just another small village or town at the time.
Correct. Although, again, these references to the priestly courses to Nazareth and the priestly courses indicates that that it may have been that the site was, in fact, that Nazareth was in fact associated by Jews with the priestly courses. Not talking again about in relation to Jesus. That doesn't make it necessarily well. And so I mean I don't want to mush things together here, because it gets, we're bouncing back and forth over the course of several centuries. So all it means is that by the third, fourth, and then into 5th and 6th centuries, right, Jewish tradition had come to associate Nazareth as the site of a priestly course. What I was pointing out with relation to what Uzi Liebner wrote is that he wrote that every site that is mentioned in these late antique, these Jewish sources from later, with priestly courses, that every one of those sites that has archaeological remains that can be identified, those archaeological remains, those are sites where archaeological remains indicate that there was settlement already from the Hasmonean period on. And if we then apply that to Nazareth, if that's true also for Nazareth, then it would mean that, Nazareth was in fact already settled in the Hasmonean period. And here I'll just read a quote from Uzi Liebner's book. And he says, quote, all the settlements on the list of the priestly courses, that's in my edition, for which we have firm data, were intensively settled following the Hasmonean conquest of Galilee at the end of the 2nd century BC. The list thus reflects a historical memory concerning Jewish settlements of the Hasmonean period in Galilee. And so, to me, the fact that Nazareth is mentioned both in inscriptions and in the Talmud in connection with a priestly course, and combined with what Uzi Liebner documents about other sites that have archaeological remains, would suggest that this is yet another piece of evidence that Nazareth was already a Jewish settlement from the Hasmonean period on.
So what you're saying is that based on the evidence that we have from later sources, that since they associate the priestly courses with Nazareth, one can assume that they already were associated with the priestly courses even in the Hasmonean period. Is that correct?
Not quite, but close. I know I'm sorry. I'll try and explain it again. So by late antiquity being, let's say, 3rd to 4th century through 5th and 6th centuries, right? By that period, Jewish traditions that are recorded both in rabbinic literature and in these inscriptions, and also I should mention in Piyutim, which is liturgical poems, provide lists of priestly courses, and the priestly courses are already listed in First Chronicles, but associate those priestly courses, which are basically families, with specific sites in Galilee. Now, there's a huge debate among scholars about whether these priestly families really lived at these sites, right? That we don't know that that's necessarily historical, or whether maybe there were priestly families at these sites at some point and later not, or that's a whole nother question. And it's not really relevant for our purposes. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. So by late antiquity, by 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, Jewish traditions, and these are multiple Jewish traditions, associated the priestly courses with specific settlements in Galilee, towns and villages in Galilee, whether or not there were actually priestly courses at any point in these towns and villages. Jewish tradition came to associate these specific ones. And it's interesting that Nazareth is mentioned both in connection with the priestly course, both in the Talmud and in inscriptions. Now, what Uzi Liebner has pointed out is that he did archaeological surveys of these sites in Galilee. And based on the archaeological surveys that he did, he was able to determine that some sites were inhabited in certain periods and other sites were not inhabited in certain periods. And he could kind of trace that through the material that he documented in his surveys. And so what he noticed is that in cases where, and so if we go back to the priestly courses and the settlements in Galilee, because all of them are in Galilee. All the settlements that are mentioned are in Galilee. Now, in many cases, these are settlements whose names are known. We actually know the names of these places. Let's see if I can find examples here. Migdal, right, is one of them. Okay, so in many cases, the name of the settlement that occurs in the priestly in these later Jewish traditions, the names of the settlements are sites that are known. Some of them are not. Some of them are names that we just don't know where they are. But a lot of them are places that we know of. And so what Uzi Liebner was able to do was to show that in cases where we know the identity of that site, and he surveyed it, and he showed that there is evidence at that site of habitation in certain periods. And in all the cases where the priestly courses are mentioned in connection with a site that can be identified, Uzi Liebner was able to determine that those sites were already occupied in the Hasmonean period. And if we then, he mentions, he lived, but he doesn't talk about Nazareth. But if we then apply this principle that he notes to Nazareth, then it would suggest that, like the other settlements that are mentioned in the priestly courses in these later Jewish, traditions and documents, that Nazareth then would have been inhabited already from the Hasmonean period on. And that would indicate that it was already known as a Jewish settlement in the time of Jesus. And again, I'm going to just reread Uzi Liebner's statement here because it's really important. All the settlements on the list of the priestly courses for which we have firm data were intensively settled following the Hasmonean conquest at the end of the 2nd century BC. The list thus reflects a historical memory concerning Jewish settlements of the Hasmonean period in Galilee. So I actually kind of think this is a smoking gun that's been kind of overlooked in discussions of the priest of Nazareth, and probably because we're talking about a piece of evidence here that's a little bit obscure, and you have to kind of make that little leap based on Uzi Liebner's observation.
I want to ask about a claim that's been going around, that's gone around in the past, that Jesus's childhood home may have been found in Nazareth, like that little house that some, for some reason, think that's his childhood home. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, here I'm a little more skeptical. I have to say, I mean, look, could it be? Sure, but it's just impossible to prove. It's I know that people want to have a real physical artifact or something physical connected to Jesus. I completely understand that. But that's not the kind of information that archaeology generally provides, especially not about lower class individuals like Jesus. I mean, if we're talking about the most prominent members of ancient society, somebody like a King Herod or, Queen Helena of Adiabene or, something like that, those kind of folks sometimes did leave identifiable remains in the archaeological record because they built monumental buildings and they had big inscriptions associated with them and, stuff like that, right? They built palaces but the vast majority of the population was not like that. They were just lower class people who lived in simple houses and ate out of simple pottery dishes and didn't, mark their buildings with monumental inscriptions or usually with any inscriptions at all. And so it's really pretty much impossible to identify physical remains associated with an individual like Jesus. And I like to say, like, sometimes people ask about the Holy Grail, right? So have we found the Holy Grail? It's the same thing with Jesus's house, by the way. So has the Holy Grail been found? Well, the only way that you would know that a cup that you found the cup that Jesus drank out of, right, at the Last Supper, would be if it had an authentic ancient inscription from the time of Jesus on it that says, "This is the cup that Jesus drank out of." I mean, right? Something like that. So you'd have to basically find in the house this is the bed. This is Jesus's bed, the bed that Jesus slept in, dating from that period, right? And they're not going to find that. There's really no way. I think the closest you can say is that the remains that we have give an impression of Jesus's setting, Jesus's world, right? So we can get an idea of what his life was like. We can see the kind of houses that he and members of his family and other members of the village lived in. We can get an idea of the kind of food that they cooked and the dishes that they ate off of, what their meals were like. We can get an idea of the environment, the kinds of animals that they raised or the crops that they cultivated, that sort of thing. But to actually identify specific remains with an individual like Jesus, I don't think that it's possible to do that. And you would need really, really strong, convincing evidence to make me change my mind.
I'm being asked from the live chat from some in the audience, do we know where the name Nazareth came from?
I know that I'm going to defer on this one. I know that there are theories about that. This thing, Netzer shoot, in Hebrew or something like that. As an archaeologist, I'm just going to defer and say the etymology, that's outside my area of expertise, and I have no, I don't know what to say about it. I'm sure I don't have anything to add that people haven't already suggested, but it's not my expertise.
But just to confirm, we do not know for sure it was called Nazareth in the 1st century and prior. Is that correct?
Well, only if you discount the gospel accounts. In other words, if we take the gospel accounts, right? So the only way that you would say that is if you're disregarding the gospel accounts, right? We don't have any independent evidence, meaning I know what you're looking for, right? You're looking for an inscription that says this is Nazareth. We don't usually find those in archaeological excavations, at least not in small sites like Nazareth. So that's not something that's likely ever to be found either. I personally think that if it's called Nazareth by, again, in Jewish sources by the 3rd to 4th century AD, that it's unlikely that name was invented, that sometime between the 1st century and the 3rd century, that name was just invented a whole cloth and appears suddenly in Jewish sources. But,
So to some degree, Nazareth, like one could say that Nazareth is completely unimportant in general. Not completely important either, but to some degree, it was already perhaps a little bit important because it was already being associated with the priestly courses that you were talking about earlier.
Well, it's associated with the priestly courses. It becomes associated in Jewish traditions that are later than the time of Jesus with the priestly courses, right? Again, and I'm not sure how far back those traditions go. They start to appear in the 3rd, 4th centuries, right? How important that is and why certain sites become associated with the priestly courses is a whole nother question. As I said, it's hard to determine whether there's a historical basis for the association of specific sites with the priestly courses, right? Whether these priestly families actually did live in these sites or not. In these, but that's a little bit off. It's a little bit irrelevant for the purposes of, the questions that you're addressing. It's an important question that scholars talk about, right? But for the purposes of Jesus and so on, it's not all that germane.
And so my closing question, are you skeptical of Jesus being born in Nazareth, or do you think that we can reasonably assume that he was born there probably, and it's not really a big deal. It's nothing that should be significantly questioned, because some are like, well, we don't know, we can't really assume he was born there. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let me just, before I answer that, let me just say my approach to all this. So the question is not an archaeological question. So I'm going to tell you what I think, but I want to clarify and say that my perspective is not a perspective based on faith. This is my, this is my opinion. And so when I say that my perspective and my answer are not based on faith, I also want to clarify that I am not interested in undermining or contradicting anybody else's personal faith and beliefs, right? That's not my goal here. So I'm going to answer you honestly, but I want to be careful and make sure that, okay. So I'm kind of surprised that you're asking me about Jesus being born in Nazareth, when, of course, according to at least 2 of the 4 gospel authors, he was born in Bethlehem, right?
Right.
So that's where, okay, so it's kind of an interesting question. Now, personally, I am skeptical that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. I don't want to rule out the possibility. Our sources are, what do we have? We have the gospel accounts. We only have 2 of the 4 gospel authors who talk about Jesus being born in Bethlehem, right? So, and their accounts diverge quite dramatically from each other. They're very different from each other, right? If you put them side by side, that's one of the exercises I have my students do, right? Put them side by side, and what's the same and what's different. And when I look at those gospel accounts of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, what strikes me is that is the pains that the 2 gospel authors went to in connecting Jesus to Bethlehem in order to prove that he was, in fact, the legitimate Jewish Messiah. Because to be the legitimate Jewish Messiah, you had to be descended from David. And there you needed that connection to Bethlehem, right? If Jesus were, in fact, a Galilean, had he been born in Galilee and not in Judea, it would be real hard to make that claim. So my personal opinion is that those birth narratives were inserted in order to connect Jesus to David by way of proving that he was, in fact, the legitimate Jewish Messiah, that he's a descendant of David. I think it's actually very interesting that the gospel authors took for granted that Jesus had to be descended from David, because that's a Jewish belief, right? So it's a very Jewish mindset. I actually do think that that just the fact, Jesus's association with Nazareth in the gospel accounts, he's Jesus of Nazareth, right? That indicates that he was, in fact, originally from Nazareth. And if, again, I'm not trying to undermine anybody's beliefs here. I will also point out, of course, that we have a huge gap in information about Jesus's childhood. In our information. So, they most of what the information that we have focuses on his final days. So, so my personal inclination when I look at the gospel accounts is to think that Jesus was, in fact, a Galilean boy, so to speak, from Nazareth, and that at least a couple of the gospel authors went to great pains to insert birth narratives connecting him to David, recognizing that this was going to validate his, the legitimacy of him being the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah. And so to me, actually, that, in that case, by the way, that would be a whole nother argument in favor of the historicity of Nazareth, right? Because otherwise, why on earth would you put Nazareth in there? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't serve your purposes. It would only make sense if, in fact, there was a Nazareth and you couldn't deny that he was from Nazareth. He was known as Jesus of Nazareth, right? So that would be a whole nother point in favor of, yes, there was a Nazareth in the time of Jesus. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't make any sense at all. You just invent the whole thing from cloth and put him in Bethlehem. I mean, really. So anyway, that's my own personal opinion. And I don't want to undermine or offend anybody who has different beliefs or, interpretations of the gospel accounts.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Jodi Magness.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.